This problem of the language law is a storm in a teacup. Why is it a storm in a teacup? Well, one would think that there's some kind of general standard that Western democracies have on issues of language, nationality policies, nation building, you name it, devolution, autonomy. But there is no such thing as a standard that is applied to everybody in North America and Europe. There isn't one. So many countries have different ways of approaching these contentious issues. And therefore, the idea that somehow Ukraine should adopt some kind of norm is ridiculous because there isn't such a thing as a norm. Let's go, for example, by country. In North America, in the US, there's as we know, and that's one of the reasons Donald Trump was elected, on the back of this sort of white nationalist backlash, there's a growing Hispanic population. Samuel Huntington warned about this problem for American identity over 15 years ago in an article in Foreign Policy. You can find it from 2004. I reread it recently, and it actually, he was criticized at the time, but he actually predicted a lot of the things that are happening today. So even though you have this growing Hispanic population in America, America is still basically based on a WASP culture and an English language. I mean, the Spanish language has not become the second state language or second official language of the US. Not yet, anyway. When you go to American websites, there's always a choice of Spanish and English. But English is still the official language of the US. So what does that mean? Are the Americans in denial? Or maybe they're just defending their nationality, which is defined in terms of the English language. What about Canada? Canada has this incredible liberal reputation around the world as a multicultural country, welcoming immigrants. And it's a very unusual country because the centre-right is not hostile to immigration or multiculturalism, which is not the case anywhere else. Usually everywhere else, the liberals and the left are pro-multicultural, pro-immigration, the centre-right are opposed. That's not the case in Canada. Not really, anyway, on the whole. Particularly with conservatives in eastern Canada. At the same time, Ukraine's new language law is actually more liberal than Canada's. So what does that mean? It's been criticized, but it's more liberal. Canada has quite tough laws where it defends its media space from American expansionism. I mean, America is a big global player in the media field, of course, Hollywood, etc. But more importantly, in terms of Quebec, 2/3 of radio and TV in Quebec have to be in French. So I'm not criticizing this. That's entirely up to the Canadians and Quebecers. But in the Ukrainian language law, it's only 50% for eastern and southern Ukraine. So Quebec, 2/3, Ukraine, 50%. So therefore, Ukraine is as liberal as Canada or more liberal than Quebec. But anyway, it's within the norm of what we would understand to be a democracy in the Western world. As for Europe, you have so many different approaches to language and nationality that, again, there isn't a norm. And there are many countries in Europe which are regarded as, like, the founders of democracy, like France, with the French Revolution of 1789, where there is no such thing as nationality. Everybody in France is French in a civic understanding of that term, which means that there is no availability for you to express yourself as a Breton, Alsace, Provence, or some kind of regional. That is a French identity based on Île-de-France, which is the identity of Paris, imposed on the rest of the country. They made one exception in France in the last sort of 10, 15 years, which is Corsica, because they had a separatist terrorist problem there, so they granted it autonomy. But other than that, France is an assimilationist country where you're expected to assimilate into French language and culture, like Quebec. So Canada isn't multicultural. It's only multicultural outside Quebec in the rest of Canada. And there are many other countries in Europe which are all bona fide members of the European Union, Council of Europe, etc., where there are different approaches. Latvia and Estonia, for example, two post-Soviet republics that were annexed by the Soviet Union illegally, were allowed to join both the Council of Europe and the European Union and then NATO, even though they adopted a very restrictive citizenship policy on nationality, which only allowed citizenship to those who were living in Latvia and Estonia and their descendants up to the Soviet occupation of 1940. So that means if you were a Russian or Ukrainian even, like a Russian speaker who came in from the 1940s, you didn't automatically get citizenship. You can get that later on, but you have to learn the language, Latvian, Estonian, and many still haven't. So there are many people without citizenship in Latvia and Estonia. But that was allowed. Why was it allowed? Well, because Germany had the same nationality policy. Germany until 2000 had a nationality policy which was based on ethnicity, not on civic identity. So to become a German, you had to be of German ethnic identity. So that means a German who grew up in Kazakhstan, who went there under Catherine the Great in the late 18th century, had more rights to become a German citizen than a Turkish immigrant to Germany who came in the 1960s. Germany changed its policy in 2000 after the a few years after the reunification of both countries. But it goes to show you that there's a huge range of approaches to these questions in Europe, and it often depends on local circumstances. For me, the most amusing aspect of the criticism of Ukraine's new language law is, of course, the countries that have been the most critical are the ones that have no grounds to be critical. Poland, are you serious? I mean, this is one of the most intolerant countries toward national minorities in history. Just think of Ukrainians in interwar Poland. There were democratic Ukrainians who tried to do things in interwar Poland in the Polish parliament. The major party was called UNDO. They were all driven into the arms of OUN because Poles were intolerant towards Ukrainians. They even actually refused to recognize them as a separate nationality. So the idea that Poles are tolerant towards national minorities, especially with the rise of Polish nationalism in the last 15 years, is simply ridiculous. Ukraine has always been more tolerant to Polish minorities, the small one still living in Ukraine, primarily in places like Zhytomyr, than to Ukrainians living in Poland. Similarly, Hungary. Hungary has a long history of being very intolerant to national minorities. That's the reason why Ukrainians living in Carpatho-Ukraine did not emerge as a nationality until the Soviet period. Ukrainians in Austrian-ruled Western Ukraine, Galicia, for example, were given support by the Austrians, whereas the Hungarians in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were very repressive. So again, I find it very amusing that the Hungarians are critical. The Greeks even more so. The Greeks are complaining about Ukraine's new language law. Why doesn't anybody go and ask a Macedonian living in Northern Greece about how tolerant Greece is towards its minorities? According to the Greeks, Greek official policy, there are no minorities in Greece. The Macedonians in Northern Greece are just Greeks who have forgotten that they are Greeks. And we've heard this in many parts of the world and in many countries, including in Poland and elsewhere. So the Greeks are not. I mean, Ukraine has been always very tolerant towards the Greek minority, which is now very small, particularly based around Mariupol in southern Donetsk. So again, I don't take that. But of course, the most amusing criticism of this language law is that coming from Russia. and you don't know whether to cry or simply just to grab them and give them a hug, Russians, when they criticize Ukraine on this. The second largest minority in Russia, after the Tatars in their own separate autonomous region, are Ukrainians. They're always ignored, sadly, by the Ukrainian government, even more so by international organizations like the OSCE, Council of Europe, and elsewhere. They're always also ignored by Western scholars writing on Russia. Because Russia is a federal system, you only then receive benefits as a national minority if you have your own autonomous region, republic, or okrug, or territory. But if you don't have that, if you're scattered around like Ukrainians are, then you don't receive any benefits in terms of education, culture, and state financing. So Ukrainians are disadvantaged. They have their national churches in Russia are closed down, repressed, and they don't have any educational or cultural facilities at all in Russia, even though they are the second largest minority in Russia. If Ukraine applied the same policies that Russia applies to Ukrainians in Russia, if Ukraine applied the same policies in Ukraine to Russians, then Russians living outside the Crimea should have no rights, because the only people who have rights as a national minority are those within a recognized autonomous region, which up until 2014 was the Crimea. So not in Donbass, not in, say, Zaporizhia, nowhere else. If Ukraine had applied the same ruling. But Ukraine was more tolerant. Just go to Ukraine. Even today, you can find Russian publications. Every website of the president, the government, and the parliament is in three languages: English, Ukrainian, and Russian. Again, I think it's rather amusing when Russia applies this. And what's happened, and again, what's not been picked up by Western observers of this, is that the Russian policies applied to Ukrainians in Russia of repression and assimilation of Ukrainians is applied in the same way to territories controlled by Russia inside Ukraine: Crimea, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, and Luhansk People's Republic, where Ukrainian churches are banned. The only church allowed is the Russian Orthodox Church, where Ukrainian language and culture is disallowed, and where there's a return to kind of harsh policies of Russification. So they've just basically imported those policies from Russia. So I really think that this new language law, criticism of it, is a complete storm in a teacup compared to many countries in the West, including Canada. This is quite a liberal policy. It's also a policy which could be argued using Western terminology that it's one based on supporting affirmative action for a language that previously was looked down upon and repressed. And therefore, the idea that somehow this will be a problem for Ukraine, its integration in Europe, is simply not, as the Hungarians have claimed and the Poles have, is simply not likely to happen. Ukraine, I think, in this respect stands out very well, and Ukraine had a very peaceful resolution of its domestic, internal linguistic, nationality, and separatist problems, for example, in the Crimea, right the way through till the Euromaidan, and it only became violent then because of outside interference, where protests became an armed insurrection because of outside interference. If there wasn't that outside interference, those protests would have been just simply protests. They would have eventually quietened down, and the usual police operations would have taken care of them. So in this respect, Ukraine has not done anything out of the ordinary, and therefore Ukrainian government should actually go on the offensive on these questions and point the finger particularly at places like Russia and say, when are you going to adopt such a liberal language law as we have done in Ukraine? Thank you.